Hello and good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is that you are sitting down and listening to this episode of Research DEcolonized. I am Laura and I'm your host today. Today I'm sitting down with Harley Eagle. I'm very excited. So, Harley, it's great to finally sit down with you. I've been to quite a few meetings with various organizations and committees where you've always taken a part in or have been like a key person in. So, when we actually got to meet each other, this past summer and I got to see you in action in real physical life. It was really exciting and I knew I just needed to invite you here. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for that. I do appreciate those kind words and I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. So do you want to introduce yourself to our listeners with as much or as little detail as you'd like? So if they don't know who you are, they know by the end of this.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Harley Eagle, and I am Dakota and Anishinaabe. Originally, I'm from Saskatchewan. I am calling in today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Comox, which includes the Pentlatch, Ayexin, and Satlut people. I'm very happy to be in these territories. I consider myself an uninvited guest in these territories, and there's a reason why I say it that way. And I recognize that these aren't my territories, so I want to be culturally safe in the way that I do my work in these beautiful territories and surrounded by the Indigenous people from these territories as well. And I say uninvited because I've fallen into colonial patterns myself, and I haven't followed the protocols of introducing myself to the people and asking permission to be on these territories. However, I am in relationship with many people from the Comox Nation, and I really feel we're building towards that time when I can offer protocols and be responded to so that I can be considered an invited guest into these territories. And then lastly, when I say uninvited guest, I say that not because I haven't felt the hospitality of the Comox people. I certainly have. We've been invited into so many different activities and, like I said, building relationship with Comox people. So we've certainly felt the amazing hospitality of the people of these territories. But I'm in my own journey of decolonizing. I hope to get back to that place where I can offer the appropriate protocols and be responded to in that way that I do feel like I'm officially an invited guest into these territories. But until that time, I'll consider myself an uninvited guest. And then just to say a little bit more about myself, as I mentioned, I am Dakota. My home community is Wapahaska Dakota First Nation, which translates into Whitecap. And that's just south of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And that's on my father's side. And my father his name is Percy Eagle, and his mother was Catherine Buffalo. And then on my mother's side, she is from a place called Key Reserve on the eastern side of Saskatchewan. And it's a Saulteaux Reserve, which is a Ojibwe-speaking part of the Anishinaabe Nation. And my mother was a Brass, and we're also related to the Kashanes and the Osoops of that part of the world. So very, very thankful to, again, on a decolonizing journey for myself of, colonization has done such a profound and, can I say it this way, a good job of disconnecting us from our relatives in a lot of ways. I think most of us as Indigenous people have felt that disconnection because of so many different activities like residential schools and the reserve system and all of those sorts of things. So I'm on a journey of reconnecting with my relatives. So in this moment, I'm thinking about my relatives out there that maybe even some of you might be listening. So I'm very, very thankful that you might be, and that helps me to make sure that I try my best to speak in a way that brings some honor and integrity to who we are as relatives. So I'll just, and then maybe just to say that I currently reside in Courtenay on Vancouver Island, and the work that I do is around Indigenous cultural safety. I work as a consultant and an independent consultant, and I work with many different agencies. A lot of work in healthcare, because that's where I kind of started my work with Indigenous cultural safety, was working for a health authority. And now that I've gone off on my own and working for myself, I still remain very connected to the healthcare world. But I also do work in the child and family services sector, in the policing sector, and also for-profit companies, and many nonprofit companies as well, or organizations as well. So that's a bit about me. I hope you now know who I am, and looking forward to the rest of this interview.
Thank you for that. That was a really great introduction. And I feel like talking about that in terms of like being an uninvited guest is really important. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. So I love that you brought that up. And I also feel like what I just learned is that you're an incredibly busy human. That's what I took from that. I'm like, oh my gosh. But again, I'm really excited to have you here. So thank you for that. So you mentioned your work in cultural safety and healthcare, et cetera, right? And I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that. You've been doing that for over 20 years. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I've been doing work around decolonizing and anti-racism for about 25 years. In the last almost 10 years now, it's been focused on cultural safety.
Okay. Wow. Oh my gosh. And you facilitated a lot of workshops, training opportunities. And we talked about this when we met in person. I actually brought it up to you a couple minutes ago before we started this, but knowing how exhausting and triggering this type of work is, what made you to decide to go into this work, and how do you keep yourself grounded when you're doing this and when this is like literally your profession?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And maybe the easy response to a question like that is to say that you have to look after yourself. And I think, we all know that putting that into practice is the difficult part of it. But I think there has to be even a deeper level of meaning and understanding and connection that makes you want to be, that helps to motivate you into looking after yourself. And for me, I sometimes tell this story. I don't often tell this story, but as an Indigenous person, I'm in my 50s now. Growing up, even though I'm a child of survivors of residential school, and I've experienced reserve life and all kinds of, the impacts of colonization, but I didn't understand it because I was raised in the public school system, and I didn't learn about these kinds of things. I still remember as a young man just entering into my 20s, not even really knowing what colonization was. I didn't understand those terms because I was conditioned and trained, if you will, in the colonial world, which is to keep you disconnected from the truth. And so, but then when I started to learn about all of the things that happened to us as Indigenous people, and it was so profound because that I could see and name and feel those impacts, as a child of survivors and of residential school, all of those sorts of things, it brings such profound perspective into your life. And so when I started to hear those stories, I started to do what I started to fantasize, if you will, because I started to think about, so what would I have done if I was a parent, say 100 years ago, and the Indian agents and the RCMP came to take my children away. I fantasized that I would resist them, that I would fight back, that I would in no way let them have my children. But then, as I started to hear more and more of the stories and learn about the history, I realized that there was probably so many of our relatives that tried to do that but couldn't. The odds were so stacked against us that we had to allow our children to be taken away, broke our hearts, and totally disrupted us and all of those sorts of things. But I probably would have been that way as well. I wouldn't have been able to not allow my children to be taken away. Now, I also want to say that there were some communities that were able to, for various reasons, able to hide their children away. So that absolutely did happen. But for the majority of us, we probably wouldn't have been able to, and weren't able to. So then when I started to realize that and work through that and process that, my fantasy changed. And it changed to start to realize that, well, but I'm here now. I'm living in this day and age. We're still living with the impacts of residential school, and there's still ongoing colonization. So I can still do things now. And so what I can do now is the work that I'm doing, right? And so then that goes back to, so the reason why I need to look after myself is because I want to make a difference, not only for myself and for those loved ones close by me, but for the overall effect and impact of colonization that's still ongoing. So we need to be healthy in order to do that. So that's how I think about that question of how can I do this work. I have to stay healthy and I have to look after myself. And then the last thing I'll say about that is that I often struggle. There's times that I'm not looking after myself, but I'm getting to a place now where I'm starting to recognize that quicker. So then I can change that pattern a little more quicker than I could, say, 5 or 10 years ago. So it takes practice. It's just like training to run a marathon. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to train and train and train and keep training. You have to be intentional about it in order to stay healthy and to respond to your body, to recognize when you're tired, when you're approaching that burnout stage, or when you're angry, and all of those sorts of things. And there's often good reason to be angry, right? And we shouldn't say there's something wrong with me if I'm feeling angry. No, we should be angry because there's so many things that are still happening to us as Indigenous people, as well as this work is exhausting. That's a reality of this work. And so then we have to learn, so how do we respond to that in an appropriate way that helps us to stay healthy and grounded?
Thank you so much for that answer. And it's funny because I just want to make a couple comments. I think it's really important, first of all, bringing up the fact that, like some people, even if they're growing up on community, especially if they're not, like they don't grow up necessarily learning the impacts of colonization, right? Because when you're raised and reared in this really colonial setting, obviously it's not going to be pointing out, hey, we did these things. This is why you're experiencing this. This is why your loved one could be experiencing this. So that's really important because I know a lot of Indigenous youth and others growing up off community or even in community, but like you said, in a public school system, who when they get into like post-secondary or young adulthood are actually really learning and starting to understand those implications. And I think it can be really substantial then on how one ends up viewing themselves and their relatives and their neighbors, better understanding and some to work through. And I think it's just so great that you went through that and then you're at this other end where you're now like, fighting the fight is what I always like to say. And I also just want to say, I really hope there are other people who are doing the same or similar work that you're doing who can hear that and hear what you do and feel validated by what you said. Because I do agree. I think there are times when it is absolutely obvious why your body may respond with anger or something. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that per se, So I hope they hear that and then can learn more about self-care and help themselves through those big feelings and exhausting times.
So I think in addition to that process, that part of our journey of looking after ourselves and, trying to stay grounded in the face of this often difficult work, is about, it's not just about us, right? Or we as an individual or just about me. It's about the connections that I have with people that are on this journey as well. I really appreciate how you just mentioned about, others that are out there that perhaps are listening. And there's others that I work with, that I have to have those connections with others that I can just go to and cry and be angry with and, or express my anger to them and they just listen. and they know what I'm talking about because they're on this journey as well. That in and of itself is so helpful, because that's like a release, right? Because we often hold all of that energy in, but we have to find those places where we can freely cry and freely be angry and express ourselves and say those things that are boiling up within us, but in a setting where it's held in a really special way, in a loving way and in a caring way, and maybe even in a way that the other person then says, yeah, I know what you're saying, I'm angry too. And that's helpful as well, because then you know that you're not alone in all of this. So you have to have those moments as well. You have to have those colleagues, and so I want to say here, I have colleagues and friends that serve that provide that for me, and also my family. My partner and my daughters, they are so helpful in just listening to me, and also calling me out when they see those patterns, because they know me well. They know when I'm stressed. They know when I'm approaching burnout and when I'm tired, because they see my actions and they're familiar with the way that I respond to those things. So they'll say it. They'll say, Dad, are you tired? I think you need to slow down a bit, Dad. And I have to learn how to listen to that and to recognize that as so important in my life, because sometimes I'll miss those things because I've entered into fight, flight, or flee or what have you. And I'm not thinking, from a grounded place in those moments. So having somebody be able to tell you that, and somebody that you're in deep relationship with, so you'll listen to them, right? Because you respect them and you love them and all of that sort of thing. That also contributes to looking after yourself. So it's not always just ourselves looking after ourselves. It's who we surround ourselves with that help us to look after ourselves too.
I love that you added that part, because it's true. And even for myself, I have a really good colleague. You may know of her, and I hope to bring her on here one day. Santana Hernandez, she's Dene, and she's actually at the University of Calgary right now completing her medical, her MD, for lack of a better word. And yeah, she's one of those people through even academe, which I constantly refer to as a colonial institution, who totally, you find your people. And exactly that, like, they recognize, they're like, hey, how are you doing? They can tell, they call you on it. And one of the best phrases from her, I will say, is she always is like, how are we going to play this? Like, how are we going to play this, girl? Mm. And so totally, you find your people. And I think that is a really important trait or tool to self-care. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As a consultant working in the realm of cultural safety and humility work, what do you think that the first step is that an institution, an organization, whether that be a healthcare or research team, whoever it is that is essentially involved in the planning and execution of a project or a program that's going to impact Indigenous people on whatever level, what do you think is that first step that they should take before they even get started, before they move forward with funding applications, implementing programming, projects, so that they can do this in a way where they're grounded in concepts of cultural safety and humility before anything gets off the ground?
I think that's a really good question to consider. And so I think what I can do to answer that question is just to share what I've noticed in the work that I'm doing with many different organizations, and why I approach the work the way that I do. And so what I think is really important in this work is being self-reflective, and being self-reflective from a place of humility. So I get approached by organizations, or sometimes organizations will be referred to me, and usually because they've done something wrong. They've created a culturally unsafe setting, or had an experience where how they approached a meeting or a gathering was culturally unsafe, and it was pointed out to them usually. So now they're in the space of, oh my goodness, what did we just do? And so then they'll be referred to people like me, or they'll come to people like me, and that's such an important place to be. And it's a place that you don't want to leave from right away. Even though it's uncomfortable, there's so much learning that can happen in that moment, and that is an aspect of humility. of recognizing that you've messed up and that you want to make things right, that you want to do something differently, or to learn what it means to do something differently. That's such a profound moment. So I really appreciate when organizations come to me with that. And then if they're just coming to me, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll meet with them and I'll talk with them. And usually they'll get to a place where they tell their story of something that has happened, or they've seen something happen with their, a partner organization where they've made a misstep, and now they're thinking, well, we don't want to make that misstep either. So what do we do to get ourselves ready to try to create culturally safe settings and partnerships? And I also want to say that I think in just saying that, it can sound like that if you do a bunch of learning beforehand, you won't make those missteps. You're more than likely going to make some missteps. And that's important to recognize too. That's humility as well, is to recognize that you're going to make mistakes. But in the learning around that, you can figure out, okay, so if we make a mistake, what are we going to do? How are we going to make things right? What's our process that we can go through to make sure that we address that as soon as we can in an appropriate way? That's humility as well, is to recognize that we're not perfect and we're going to make mistakes, and there's a lot of rich learning that happens in mistakes. So that's what I think about those organizations that are thinking about doing this work, is to be reflective and to really authentically consider, or maybe even work with somebody that can help you from an external standpoint and point of view, is to help you to think about your journey and where you might have made some mistakes and not even recognized it. And sometimes with organizations too, you can point out, based on where they're at in this moment, you can point out to them, so you've probably made some mistakes and not even known it. Because sometimes organizations will come to us and they'll say, we don't have any Indigenous staff, or we don't have any Indigenous people on our board, or we don't have any Indigenous partnerships, but we know we should. But if they know they should, then there's an indication there of them not having those relationships, that there's something culturally unsafe about their approaches because they don't have those relationships. So you can help them reflect and to see things in that way as well, and then work with them to help them get ready to engage with Indigenous people. And that's a big that's a really important step to know for organizations, is that you have to get ready. You have to prepare, because we've all been trained very well in a colonial system, right? And so we've picked up those patterns, and we often think that that's normal. That's just the way things are. But that's not true. From Indigenous perspectives, we want to point out that no, things are, in fact, the ways that we've considered normal in our Western world are very colonial and very culturally unsafe. So creating that setting where you can point those things out is helpful for organizations. And then that helps them to know what their starting point is.
So when we met, you were actually involved with a funding organization that didn't involve Indigenous consultation or appropriate training around cultural safety at the start point. So as someone doing the work you do, how do you actually feel when you enter this space, if that's something you feel like sharing? And with that relationship, which we can obviously keep confidential, like, what was your first step when you walked in there and realized that, oh dear, like, they need some help?
Yeah, I think the first step is about making sure that I am grounded, because I'm Indigenous, and because if an organization is coming to me and sharing their missteps, then I have to make sure that I'm grounded so that I don't become escalated or triggered myself. So that's really the first step, is to make sure that you're grounded. And then I listen. And I'm listening for some really specific things. Is one, I'm listening for their sense of their humility, because that's important, right? That's a value and this work is so value based, and there's no, it's not a coincidence that the work that we do is cultural safety and cultural humility. Right. So that's bringing forward the humility, and cultural humility is the process of working towards building culturally safe spaces. So it's a value-based process. So that's what I listen for. Are they speaking to knowing that they and feeling that they have made a misstep and that they want to make things right? So that's what I'm listening for. And then some other things that I'm listening for is their level of understanding and knowledge around the history and the experiences of Indigenous people. Is that coming through in their stories that they're sharing with me about their missteps? And then I'm also listening for their skills. So are they talking about things like trauma-informed practice, anti-racism? Are they talking about things like mindfulness, or, just there's a whole quadri of skills that I'm trying to listen for. And if they're not sharing that, then I'll ask them, what's your level of understanding of trauma-informed practice? What's your level of understanding of anti-racism or whiteness or white supremacy? Things like that. And when I ask those questions, I'm also gauging the responses, because a lot of those anti-racism or talking about whiteness or white supremacy or colonialism, those are often triggering words. So it's almost like you're listening for the response to gauge their level of understanding, which then helps me to understand what I can offer them to increase their understanding. And then the third thing that I'll listen for is their commitment. So how committed are they to truth and reconciliation? How committed are they to Indigenous cultural safety or trauma-informed practice? And so you can start to hear their level of commitment. And then the fourth piece to all of this is trying to gauge where leadership is at. Because sometimes it's middle managers or frontline workers that will come and talk to me, and sometimes it'll be around, they'll use phrases like, I wish our leadership understood this, or I wish our board understood this. So that's helpful for me to hear as well. But it's really helpful if it's leadership that is coming forward and saying, we did this and we have to do something about it, and we need to be better at it because we're committed to this relationship. We're committed to truth and reconciliation. So it's a facilitation skill. I think is that that's what I'm listening for, and how I approach engaging with organizations that might want to be on this journey, or feeling the pressure to be on this journey because they've made a misstep. But just to reiterate one more time, the first step really is about myself, making sure that I'm grounded, because I can easily get triggered and that sort of thing. And you have to have a clear mind in those moments as a facilitator, because sometimes organizations, without even knowing it, are looking for things like validation, or they're looking for me to get them off the hook. For me to like, maybe just our way of dealing with conflict is often to deflect it. So maybe they're listening to see if I'll say, well, actually, it wasn't your fault, it was their fault, right? So you have to be really aware of conflict dynamics as well in this work. And that's been something that's been really helpful for me, because that's my background as well. I do a lot of work with restorative justice and conflict resolution and transformation. My master's degree is conflict management and analysis, so I have those kind of dynamics going through my head as well as a facilitator, and I think that's really helpful, especially because my own feeling about our colonial history here in Canada is that we live in a long-standing conflict. I think people don't realize that in here in Canada, that for the last 400 or 500 years, we've been in a conflict situation that's never been resolved, right? And as Indigenous people, we feel the impact of that conflict all the time. You can see it in the structures of our society in terms of the reserve system and, the residential schools, all of those things that are that are foisted on people in terrible and violent ways is colonization, and that to me is conflict. There's nothing nice about it, and some people might say that it's unintentional, but I think it comes from that mindset of colonization. So we have to have that level of understanding as well, and to recognize that conflict patterns will show up in just about in everything that we do.
I was wondering, you mentioned that one of the things you're listening for is that level of understanding, around like the knowledge and history of colonization, et cetera. Without being generalizing, what have you found? Like, do you find it varies? Like there's some people who know the history and understand the history of colonization, or are there more so people who really don't know? Because I remember even when I was in high school, in our textbook, there was literally a sentence about Louis Riel, about how he led the rebellion. And that was it. Like, that was it. Nothing else. So I'm really curious as to what you've seen.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think as far as the level of understanding of colonial history, especially from Indigenous perspectives, is changing. I would say that in my experience of doing this work for 25 years, where I kind of cut my teeth on this work is in the United States. We were living on Pine Ridge Reservation, and that's where I started to learn about the history from Indigenous perspectives and the ongoing reality of colonization through the Oglala Lakota people who I'm related to as well. So I was working with my own people, learning about this, on the ground, if you will, and working with people that for generations have been resisting colonization. So it was such a rich learning environment for myself, at a personal level and then at that systemic level as well. And so, and then the work of anti-racism too, that's where I started learning was in the United States. So I had that context for my learning. So then when we would come home to Canada, and this was about 20 years ago, when we'd come home to Canada to visit and we'd talk about racism and anti-racism, the anti-racism work that we were doing, a lot of times the response was, well, that's good. That's good work that you're doing down there because they have a big problem with racism down there. They would often say, but up here in Canada, we're so lucky. We have a multicultural society and even language like, and we treat our Native people good here in Canada. Those kinds of responses 20 years ago. I would say in the environments that I'm working in now, that's changed and changing, where people are starting to recognize at a deeper level. And in some ways, I think because we haven't been talking about it here in Canada, that the level of understanding and then therefore then the harm is almost, it's harsher at times because there's this obliviousness to what's happened here in Canada. And continues to happen here in Canada. But like I say, that's starting to shift. We're starting to see I would say a lot more awareness, not nearly to the level that I think we should be, but at least there's some deeper understandings. And I think the TRC was really helpful in that. And then efforts like Idle No More and, the work that's being done around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, those kinds of efforts have been so helpful for bringing awareness to a lot more Canadians and to this environment. And I'm seeing that and feeling that. I'm very thankful for all of those efforts that have happened in the last couple decades that have really pushed this understanding a lot further on. And it's easier to work with groups. And then I think another aspect something that's I think has really changed our landscape has been when the first little ones were found in Kamloops, the first 215. I think that was such a profound, heartbreaking story. I think especially for those of us as who are Indigenous and connected to those experiences, but then for the rest of Canada as well. I mean, that's such a powerfully tragic story and experience that I think it opened a few more eyes and touched a few more hearts. And so I think we're starting to see just how powerful the voices of those little ones that are finally coming forward, that were buried for so long. So yeah, and we need to honor that too. That is such a powerful force, that I think we need to pay attention to that and to build on that. That's honoring those little ones.
I think that's so important that you brought that up. And you're so like gentle and kind when you talk about it, because I think I go to that point. I need to work on myself and my awareness, because I go to a point where I'm like not as patient and kind as you are, I would say, with that. I think I want to touch on the fact that you had said, you said this statement, and I think people need to hear that more. Like, we live in a long-standing conflict, 400, 500 years of colonization that has not been resolved. I think that's so important to just reiterate. I want people to hear that, because it hasn't been resolved. And I'm wondering, when you're in these relationships, in the workplace, do you find that a lot of the people you work with actually understand that, or are they still that kind of, oh, this was the past perspective, like, oh, this happened, it's done, versus, oh, we're actually still ongoing every day. It's still an ongoing process.
Yeah, again, another really good question. And I would say, based on my experience, it varies once again, that there are some people that get it, right, at that level, and recognize that Canada, that colonial entities have done so much harm. And usually there's a lot of emotion when they're expressing that. So you can tell that they're feeling it, right? And they get that this has happened and continues to happen, and they want to be a part of doing something about it. But then there's others, that aren't at that level of awareness, that haven't, been able to have experiences that point that out to them. Or there's also, I think, the pushback, especially if so let me just go back here and just say, like, the process for the way that I think about cultural safety work, if you look at the literature around cultural safety, it talks about the three steps, if you will. And the first one is around knowledge. So building your awareness of what's happened here. And we like to add the word understanding to knowledge, because understanding then helps you to recognize that you're a part of this story as well. So what's your connection with this knowledge, with this colonial history? That's so important, is to figure out, so where do you sit in this big picture? And no matter what your background is, where do you sit in this historic and current reality? And then the second step is around skills. So that's where you can start talking about things like trauma-informed practice and anti-racism and, regulation. There's so many different skills, but that's kind of the third step in the cultural safety journey, the second step in the cultural safety journey. And then the third step is action. And oftentimes it's talked about as collaborative action. So what are we going to do about this together, right? And I like to use the word emergent as well, because sometimes we work from defining the action that we're going to take, and then we work towards that action. I really think we should be building our awareness and our understanding, building our skills, and then the action emerges out of that journey. So that's how I think about that. But then we add a fourth step to all of this work, and it really becomes the first step. And that's building the container that can hold these conversations, that can provide the best context or best environment for the awareness building, because it's triggering, and it's, for those folks that are non-Indigenous, you're going to be defensive, right? Because suddenly your world, and Canada has it's characterized as this, peaceful nation, multicultural, peacemakers and, peacekeepers and things like that, and safe country and all of that. But if you look at through the eyes of Indigenous people and other marginalized groups, you start to realize, oh, it's not that at all. And that can be very jarring for people that have never looked at that before. So that's why building that container that can hold those conversations and hold that awareness building is so important. And that's what I mean about, for those, I think for some people, they've had that experience of awareness being kind of thrust in their faces, or it's too much for them. They've been overwhelmed, right? And so when you're overwhelmed like that, usually you go back to your original thought and you hold on to that as hard as you can. The work that we try to do is to build a container where you can start to let go of some of those long held beliefs that you might have about Canada, so that we can be working on this together, right, to change and transform our colonial society.
I've definitely experienced this with my own non-Indigenous family members, as well as friends and colleagues. And I think I totally see what you're talking about here, because I believe that we have these original long-standing beliefs about Canada being this really great multicultural country. And for many people, I think our country, it's part of how we see ourselves and contributes at least to like our sense of self and pride. And when we come at people too hard, or something we've said is perceived as an attack, I think people shut down. And when they shut down, they're doing this to protect themselves. And when we're in this state of self-preservation or protection, I don't think you can really get anywhere. You can't really get in there. So it's really cool to hear how you're able to navigate these situations, or perhaps better said, actually prevent that shutdown from occurring when you're in these interactions with people doing this type of work. I have a question, and it might also help the listeners, but I remember when I first started getting into similar work you're doing, definitely not at all to the extent people were using like the term cultural competency, but then came up argument, right? Like, how on earth can you become competent in someone else's culture, right? And then we hear like cultural safety and cultural humility, and there's all these like workshops and things you'll see, like cultural humility or cultural safety 101 type thing. Can you give me at least your version of a definition of the difference when we're talking about cultural safety versus cultural humility? I know you talked a little bit about that humility, kind of setting the stage for that, but can you give a little more of like a specific definition and an understanding of those two terms?
Sure. Again, really good question. The way that I think about things like cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, cultural competency, all of those things are parts of cultural safety, because you have to have, an understanding of what's happened here. So the awareness and then the sensitivity, you have to be able to feel this, right? You have to have empathy and, all of that, and compassion and all of that. And then competency, I think about things like protocols when I think about competency. Cultural competency doesn't mean for me that non-Indigenous people or people from not from a specific cultural group has to learn how to be that culture. It just means, how do you interact with that culture in an appropriate way? That to me is about cultural competency, right? It's about the interactions, because you can't become that which you aren't, right? And not a part of that community. But you can learn how to interact with that. So that's where then for me, protocols, land acknowledgements, those are important things to learn, because those are your entry points into those communities. That's you being competent in your interaction with those communities. So that's a part of cultural safety as well. But where cultural safety, or what cultural safety brings to all of that, is the awareness of the power, the misuse of power, the power dynamics, right? This is why we start talking about things like racism and white supremacy, because we want to help people understand what are those dynamics of power, misuse of power, and hierarchical power and patriarchal power, and all of those sorts of things. We have to understand that those elements are infused within the colonial system. So we have to understand that, so that we can start to undo those patterns. And I'm kind of going like this, but really it starts with looking inward, right? So how do those power dynamics show up within myself? That's hard work to do, is to recognize that. And I certainly carry that and get that as a male in this society. I'm on my own journey of recognizing how sexism shows up in me, and how those power dynamics show up in me all the time. And I have to figure out, how does my journey look to undo those patterns within myself? And again, going back to that aspect of knowing that you're going to make mistakes, I mess up all the time, and I know I cause harm to especially to those I love the most, my partner and my daughters. But I have to figure out, so how can I be on this journey of changing those? And then also, I know I mess up. So what are my patterns for addressing that? For making things right in this moment and continuing my learning journey, so that I not do that as much as I have, and I'm learning, but I still have a long way to go. So so that to me is cultural safety, right? Is to recognize that you're going to make mistakes, and but then what are you going to do about those mistakes in a way that keeps you in relationship with the other. So then that to me, and as I'm speaking about my own journey, I know that I'm going to be working on that for the rest of my life. But now think about that as an organization or a society. We're going to be working at this for generations, that cultural safety space that we define as, a space that recognizes those power imbalances so that it creates an environment free of racism and discrimination, so that people are heard when they're being provided healthcare or services or research, whatever it may be. That's an aspirational place. We have to recognize that it's probably going to take us many generations to get there. So if that's the case, then we have to ask the question, so how do we get there then? So what's the process that's going to sustain us to get there? And that to me is where cultural humility comes in, because it defines that process of being self-reflective, looking inward first. And that, again, is not an easy thing to do. So there has to be respectful and careful processes, that container building, the tone setting. And just as a side note, that's why it's so powerful to work with Indigenous cultural safety, because we have processes. The circle process is a really good example of Indigenous, what I call the genius and brilliance of Indigenous ways, right? That helps to build that container. It's a process that's been tried and true for, thousands of years. So of course it's going to work well for this work that we do. It helps to build that process where we can be self-reflective, where we can, from a safe enough place, recognize the power dynamics that surround us and that we carry within ourselves, so that we can be on this journey together to try to get to cultural safety, to creating cultural safety.
Thank you again for that. And that clarification, I feel like that really makes things make more sense, at least to me, because these terms, and then some people are like, don't use that term. So I feel good. And I feel like you really explained that well. I'm actually going to jump ahead to a question that I had planned ahead, because I think you just kind of opened up that segue. So when you talk about, this process of humility and working on that within yourself being lifelong, do you kind of find yourself having to tell people that during your training, make them aware, hey, this is a lifelong process of changing and growing? And if you do, what's the general response to that? Do you find people feel perhaps overwhelmed, or is it more like an aha, oh, okay, I'm going to move forward with this? What have you kind of seen and experienced firsthand?
Yeah, I think when I mentioned that this is a lifelong journey, it's going to take generations, I think there's, again, all kinds of responses. Sometimes there's well, no, this has to happen now because we're in need right now. And absolutely that, we should be able to say, yes, we do need to do some things now to address those concerns, those needs that are happening right now. So let's do that kind of work as well. But as far as systemic change, where we have established patterns within our society that don't allow for those things to happen, because we've been learning for generations how to function as a caring society, that's going to take that time. So sometimes people are relieved as well, because they think that they should be getting this right now, but yet they're not understanding it. So they're frustrated with themselves because I don't get it, right? And so then when you hear that oh, this is a multi-generational thing, so I can breathe a little bit here and do what I can in this moment, knowing that I'm going to continue and learn more, and I can pass on things to the next generations and they'll learn even more, so there is that sense of relief as well. The the trick there is not to get people feeling relieved enough where they say, well, I'm not going to do anything today because, we got a lifetime to worry about this. We still have to be active like all the time, but to recognize that those smaller, if you will, steps and things that we can do are just as important, and in fact are integral to the creation of a different society. So when I talk about this, when I first introduced this concept, I talk about it within what I would call the protocols part of the workshops that I do, or the tone setting part, that building that container. And part of building that container is talking about values. So I talk about 7 values that come from my teachings and other Indigenous teachings as well, but they might be expressed differently depending on who you are and what setting you're in. But one of the values is generosity. And so we talk about generosity as kindness, right? It's having that kindness to be able to share with somebody that might be in need, that you might have something. And I connect it to the root of the word kind, which is kin, which is relative, right? So acting as a relative. And when a relative comes to you that you love and appreciate, of course, you're going to give what you have, right? So getting to that place of acting out of kindness. But the first part of the word generosity is the same part of the first part of the word in the word generations. Generosity, generations. So then that has me thinking about that old story. I'm sure many of your listeners know the story that says, true kindness is when old men plant trees knowing that they'll never experience the shade or the fruit of it, but they do it nonetheless for the next generations. And so that's how I think we have to think about this work as well, that there's things that we can do now that we might not experience the impact of it, but the next generations can. And that's captured, I think, in that value of generosity.
That's a really powerful piece. And I think it's funny, we're seeing that in a lot of the arguments coming about from Indigenous and non-Indigenous people pertaining to the climate justice going on in the movement there, right? I won't indulge too much in that, but it's great to see that in other contexts. So in general, too, for the type of work you're doing, can I ask, how are you finding the overall response to this from the people you're being hired by, or who've been recommended to you, or you've been recommended to them to work with? How are they generally responding to this? But as well as from the greater community, like other Indigenous colleagues, friends, family, with the work that you're doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the way that I respond to that question is going to be a struggle for me, because I don't want it to sound like I'm bragging in any way. But this is what I'm noticing, is that because and maybe just before I answer that question, there's a piece that I want to say that's really connected to that question as well, but I haven't raised yet, and that's the what's often called the somatics. So somatics is about how your body responds, and almost like it's like you're not aware of it, but your body responds in a certain way, and that's really the leading edge right now of anti-racism work. Through many people are talking about this, but somebody that comes to mind is a therapist and author by the name of Resmaa Menakem. And he wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands. He's a Black man, a therapist from the United States, but he talks about how, that's the work we haven't really done within the anti-racism work. We've done a lot of, academic work and, making connections and appealing to people's sense of right or wrong to work on racism. But we haven't talked about how our bodies have been trained and conditioned in a colonial world. So that we end up just doing things without even thinking about it. That's what somatics is. You're not thinking about it. You just respond in a certain way. So that's really the leading edge, I would say, of decolonizing work and anti-racism work. But it's really exciting. And I think it's really profound, because I think that's what healing is, right? Is to recognize that your body's been impacted in so many different ways. And if we can start working on that and conditioning ourselves to respond in different ways, that I think has so much power to create a difference in this work. And so I think that the cultural safety process speaks to that. And that's the genius and brilliance of Indigenous ways. Protocols, we're all about making sure we're reminded of how we should be responding when we come together to gather, to celebrate, or to do ceremony, or to do hard work together, or to deal with conflict. We did those protocols to help to remind us of how to respond, right? And those the reminders were based on our teachings that we would hear all the time, or the ceremonies, the songs, all of that, helped us to be conditioned in a certain to respond in a certain way to our Indigenous environment. And so that's what I think protocols is doing. And this work really helps us to connect to our bodies, to our emotions, our responses. It helps us to understand, how, what's going on for us when we hear this difficult kind of material, what's going on in our brains in terms of trauma, that sort of thing. So saying all that, it's really connected to your question, because I think the response that we're getting to this work is people want to go deeper, right? It's the work that I often do is kind of like entry point. Like I use Indigenous cultural safety as an entry point into understanding our colonial environment. But when you get to that level of understanding of what we're up against in this colonial environment and how you've been impacted, how we've all been impacted by colonialism, it gives you gives you a thirst for more. And that's the response that I think we're getting in this work, is people want to know more and they want to go deeper and they want to understand, more, because it changes you, if you will. And that has to do with our somatic responses. If you start to alter some of those, you have this deeper desire to keep going and to keep peeling back layers and to learn more about yourself and the impacts, and then, what you can do to create change. So that's been the response. It's when I went, started to do this work outside of an institution and on my own, it's just grown, and I feel quite, frankly overwhelmed by the response, and for the connections that keep coming, in some ways almost daily, for this work. So, and that's a good thing. And I know the colleagues that I work with and others that I work with, they're feeling the same as well. That if we can get to that place of connecting at that much deeper level, people want more, because it speaks to us as human beings. Colonization, I think, by definition, it's an attack on that which was already on the land. Like, so a colonial entity comes in and it has to disrupt the patterns that were established in that territory, in that land, in order to put a different understanding in its place. That's colonialism. So in my understanding, colonialism is about the disruption, the destruction of relationships. That's why residential schools, had to be in place, because it had to disrupt that family connection and that understanding of parenting and, connection with community and land and all of those things. All of that had to be disrupted in order to put something else in place. And so if that's what colonization is, if it's a disruption of relationship and destruction of relationship, then decolonizing is about the restoration of relationship. And so if we use processes that speak to us as Indigenous people, they just, by the natural way that they are put together, speak to us as relational people, as people who have emotion, that have spirit, that have, all of these things. And so it really does speak to people, and it becomes really meaningful. And I think that's a part of why there's this desire for more in doing this work in this way. It's really not based on me. It's based on the teachings of who we are as Indigenous people.
Thank you again for such another great answer. I don't think perhaps I've witnessed it, but yeah, I haven't heard a ton about that, like, somatic aspect of this type of work. It is very much like, what's in the literature, what are people saying type thing. So it makes sense that there's this whole different level of processing that has to occur. Because with any type of, like, right, trauma therapy, etc., like, we're seeing things like EMDR being implemented where we're having that
Yeah.
movement of the eyes, you see breath work, all these things. So it makes sense, but it still feels so new to hear about.
And those are all skills, like in that journey of Indigenous cultural safety, the step beyond knowledge and understanding, it's skills. To me, that those are the skills too. EMDR is wonderful. Freedom tapping, breathing that you mentioned. There's so many different skills that we can actually, we have folks that are trained in the Western world on those processes, right? They can bring that into this work. It's very helpful because it connects us to our body, and it connects us to our nervous system that's been so underutilized. And that's what I mean about colonialism. I think colonialism does that as well. It tries to separate us even within our bodies. And I think the medical world the Western medical world is so separated from how we are an entity of many different parts working together. But oftentimes in Western medicine, we focus just on one piece, right? And try to address that one little piece without recognizing that it's connected to all things. And so then going back then to your, you said something about the, like what's going on in our natural world, and climate change and all of that. I think that we'll get to those places of recognizing that if we can wake ourselves up to what's happened. And that's what I think is the power of Indigenous cultural safety. It's an entry point into understanding all of these, not only connections, but the disconnections. And probably one of the most major one is our disconnect from the living world around us and what we've done to this world without from that place of disconnect. Right. And so we have to get back to that place of recognizing how we're connected. And so what are we going to do about the harm that we've created through that disconnection? So, so I think it is all connected, and we'll get to those places if we can, and again, Indigenous cultural safety is I think, a good entry point into that. And then I also think that there's many entry points, like you can enter in through the concern that many people have around the climate. Is that's an entry point as well, that you can make that connection back to healthcare, right, and health research. You'll get there if we can continue on this journey of always peeling back layers, recognizing that connection, that disconnect, and then figuring out ways of reconnecting as well.
I love that approach. And I hope to see more of that too, because it is, right? Like these processes, how we live our day to day, like it becomes automatic, kind of like we're just running on things. And I think when people can reconnect all these pieces instead of just treating them as different entities within themselves, right? Like we get kind of that whole picture. And I think that's where the magic happens. So you kind of answered this, so I don't know if you have to go too far into detail. I am switching gears as we're coming to the end of this amazing conversation. A lot of the questions and answers here, I think they're going to be really valuable to funders. I think they're going to be valuable to different organizations, institutions. And truly, if we can help decolonize these spaces and make them safer for Indigenous people, like that to me is one of the ultimate goals, right? And we talked about how this work isn't easy. It doesn't happen overnight. And these are still everyday unsafe spaces and places for Indigenous people. So do you have anything to say specifically for Indigenous students, employees, patients, participants, researchers that are actually trying to thrive in these spaces, healthcare, whether they're as patients or as practitioners being met with like systemic racism, et cetera, students in academia, all of that. Like, do you have any recommendations? I know you talked about having yourself be grounded and that self-care piece, but I wondered if you wanted to expand on that at all in this context.
Yeah, I think what I would say to that question is, I learned this many years ago when I first started in this kind of work, fairly quickly into that journey. I started to work on racism and anti-racism. And what we'd often hear in our workshops is, well, what about sexism? What about classism? What about ageism? What about able-bodyism? And what we would say was that, yes, absolutely, we have to be working on those as well. But for our workshops and for this learning, let's understand race and racism, because those patterns of oppression based on things like that will help us to understand the patterns of sexism and able-bodyism and ageism and all of those sorts of things. So that's what I feel about this work around Indigenous cultural safety as well. Like a lot of the work that I do, as I mentioned, is focused in healthcare. And so if we're trying to create culturally safe spaces for Indigenous patients and communities, but these patterns can also help us to understand other dynamics within our colonial society that need attention. And I think about this in terms of myself as an older person, and knowing that there's so much that we can learn from young people. But I think that we've fallen into patterns of tuning our young people out and not listening to them. But this kind of work can help us to understand that dynamic of it's so important to listen to all the voices. And so I think as, professors, instructors, people who are, delivering content in university settings or college settings, wherever it may be, or school settings, learning also how to listen to young people is so important, because that will give you profound direction into what you can offer back. If you're listening to what young people are saying, then you'll learn about yourself for one thing, and then it becomes more of a partnership and a collaboration of learning together, that you as a person in power within those systems can bring in things that are meaningful and relevant to those young people, right? So that's just one example I think that I can offer, because sometimes I think maybe this isn't quite true, but I'm going to say it anyway, that maybe the opposite of humility is arrogance, right? And so if we operate from a place of arrogance, that I am the knowledge keeper and I am, looking down on you and offering this all to you, that's not a helpful place. So how do we get to that place as research organizations or funders, to recognize that we're all in this together, and that there's so much that we can learn from those voices that are typically marginalized and not listened to and just considered, you just don't do it. Just like, I think you mentioned that earlier, we fall into these patterns of just the way we do it, right? I think we have to trouble that, and we have to start learning how to listen to those voices that we've been trained and conditioned to not listen to, right? So that's what I think I would offer to healthcare organizations and research organizations and universities, and to students too, like to know that your voice is important. And I'm not sure what to say, but to those voices that are students, because part of me wants to say demand to be heard, but I'm not sure. I think we have to be doing that work amongst, like I have to be doing this work among academia and those places that hold the power. They have to do their work to recognize that they have to be listening to those voices. It's not on the shoulders of young people or marginalized people to say that we have to be listened to. They do need to be listened to, but I think for those of us that are in those power structures, further up the hierarchy, if you will, we have to learn what that means to change those patterns and actually listen to the people that typically aren't.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. It's really interesting you bring that up. I'm going to jump back to that climate justice really quickly, just because this is actually something a couple colleagues and I are looking at. Youth being perceived like very range, right? Like culturally specific, and their involvement and their voices in the climate justice and climate change movements. So it's funny because some of the findings we are finding is that literally like some of those voices, they're being like snuffed out, right? And it's particularly interesting because they themselves, drawing back to that story about planting that tree, knowing you're never going to really see it or reap the benefits of the fruit, but it's for the next generations. These are the generations that are going to be inheriting this land once we're all gone, right? So super interesting. And it's great that you said that. Is there anything else that I haven't touched on that maybe you'd like to just share with our listeners, or that just even popped into your mind as we're talking today?
I know in a previous conversation and some thoughts that you had sent to me, you had asked me the question of what kind of like what kind of research am I interested in? And because, I think much of your audience is health research, I think of the words, or some words that have really helped me a lot. Dr. Terry Aldred shared these with me, and they come from Dr. Nadine Caron, who I'm sure you know these wonderful people. But I really appreciate her words where she said, we need our stories that can't be forgotten and the data that can't be ignored. And I think that that's so important to the research realm. Is, for one, the stories are important. And I think research can suss out that data that can't be ignored, right? So I think there's a huge role for health research in decolonizing, right? To bring forward that awareness, right? People respond when they can see it on paper and they can see the data that says, well, look, I mean, that's what drove the movement of Indigenous cultural safety, was recognizing that Indigenous people are always at the top of the list in terms of health disparities, right? That's the data that can really drive this work. But then when you connect it to the stories, not only the stories of harm, but our profound stories of who we are in terms of that genius and brilliance and connection to our understandings of land, values, language, cultural practices, how we thought about family, beyond the nuclear family. There's so much that we can learn from, people like us as Indigenous people. And so that's why I think that statement is so profound. But I think the work that I'm interested in terms of research is what I would call colonial culture. Because I want to understand, and we do this work, and I'm sure you remember this from the session that we were in together, where I talked about the older story of colonization, right? So we applied the motto of trauma-informed practice to the story of colonization. So the motto of trauma-informed practice is rather than saying that something is wrong with someone, work from the understanding that something has happened. So we applied that motto to the story of colonization, because if you only look at the last 400 or 500 years of the history of this part of the world, that conflict that we were talking about earlier, it's terrible, right? Everything that's happened, and so many terrible things have happened to us as Indigenous people, genocidal in nature, that will leave you at a place of saying, well, what was wrong with European people to come to these shores in this way? But if we can get to that place of changing that to, so what happened to European people to bring them to these shores in this way? I think that gives us deeper insight into what I would call colonial culture. So what is it that has us functioning in this colonial way, in this colonial mindset that we know is so harmful, not only to Indigenous people, but to everybody, like women and all of the isms that we talked about earlier, and the environment, comes from a certain mindset. So I think that's what I'm interested in is, so let's understand where that came from. My own personal opinion is it comes out of trauma. It comes out of the colonial experience of people from other parts of the world as well, right? So out of that trauma came this survivalist way of living, then created a culture around that as well. So that's what I mean about colonial culture. And so I want to understand those kind of dynamics so that we can change those dynamics and look to Indigenous ways of knowing and being that can help define what another way of living could look like.
That's incredibly fascinating. And I'm wondering, are you pursuing this as like independent research, like for yourself, et cetera? Or are you taking that into the world of academe? I say with air quotes. Like, what does that look like for you? Is this just personal research to enhance your, yeah. That's amazing.
No, at a personal level, just to answer your question, at a personal level, I kind of resist the pull to go back into academia in that way. I work a lot with academia, but not as not to get my PhD or doctorate or anything like that. I would love it if others did that kind of work and brought that forward. I would totally encourage that, support that, be a part of that. But I'm not sure if that's a part of my journey. But I do talk about it a lot. like in the work that we do, especially around somatics and understanding how that has shaped our body responses. And in fact, the work of that I mentioned earlier of Resmaa Menakem in his book My Grandmother's Hands, he speaks to that. He speaks to that older story of colonization, of where this fear of dark-skinned people came from. He goes back, many generations to look at other societies and other parts of the world to recognize where this fear of the other, especially around skin color, came from, right? And so it shows up somatically as well. So that to me, I think, is something that we haven't really been looking at, and I think we need to look more about that. And then, as I say too, in my work, I talk about it a lot, and I hear it a lot, because people will often express, like when you ask that question about, working with an organization, what do you listen for, especially if they've done, a wrong, people will often express how they're feeling or what their body reaction. They won't even know it. Right? They'll use comments like, well, my heart started to race, or things like that. And so I'll focus on those and bring those forward to talk about that somatic response that they're having to this, and maybe even ask the question, so how are you feeling? What was going on in your body even before the meeting or as you entered into the meeting? And they'll talk about, well, my heart was racing. So then they're already at an escalated place. They're already at fight, flight, or freeze. And then you can even start to peel back some more layers to figure out, so why were you, where do you think that fear came from that you were carrying even before you went into the workshop or to the meeting, right? So it's such a profound area to think about, to learn about, to know more about, and then to see how it shows up in our everyday life and how it contributes to culturally unsafe settings. So it really is profound. And maybe if I was 20 years younger, I would consider, taking that time. But yeah, I hope somebody does look more into that and do some work academically around that older story of colonization.
I say this partially jokingly, but also completely seriously to all of the Indigenous graduate students listening to this podcast. You have just been given like a thesis, so take it and run with it. No, seriously, that is so interesting. Like I will be, and again, it sounds like a joke, but I'm serious. I will probably be Googling this after, as well as that book by Resmaa, My Grandmother's Hands. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. I've stolen quite a bit of your time today. It was absolutely amazing. I want to open it up just quickly to our listeners. If they have any questions that they'd like me to direct to you or something, they can email me directly at lauramcnabcoombs@uvic.ca. If they have any questions or comments. And yeah, again, thank you so much, Harley. It was amazing to talk to you today.
Well, thank you so much for asking me to be here. And maybe I can end just with this, especially because I think about your Métis background, and we have connection to Métis people as well. And thinking about somatically and thinking about innovation and creativity for trying to address these things, I think we have to get to using creative and innovative ways to address what we need to address. And I think of the words of Louis Riel when he said, for my people will sleep for 100 years, and it'll be the artists who wake them up. I love that quote. I use art and music in my workshops as much as I can, and I use it in my own life as well, because I think there is somatically there's an experience that you have with art, in the various ways that we express it that way, that I think we have to pay attention to, and there's a lot of power behind that. And I think that's the wisdom of somebody like Louis Riel, who knew that, and that's what can wake us up, and inspire us, and maybe there's no better way than saying it than wake us up to the reality of the work that's before us and that we need to be doing together.
Oh, thank you so much for leaving us on this note. I have a big grin, listeners, if you could only see me. Thank you so much. And that was Research Decolonized. Tune in for our next episode coming out at the end of February. See you guys.